Hi everyone, welcome to the SIGSI Conference and welcome to the education session of today's proceedings. My name is Mark Zarb and I'm the Director of Education for SIGSI. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Sally Fincher, who will present our education keynote. Professor Fincher is, as of today, Professor Emerita at the University of Kent and has done some extraordinary work in computing education, with her work placing a particular emphasis on teachers and teaching processes. She has worked on several major computing education projects, including the very excellent Cambridge Handbook of Computing Education Research, published last year. Sally will speak to us today about educational resilience, and on behalf of the audience, I would like to thank her for taking the time to do so today.
Okay, let's hope you can see my screen.
Yep.
Is that okay?
Indeed.
Good. All right.
Thank
Hello,
you.
everybody. I'm going to talk about educational resilience. It seems to be a sensible thing to be talking about at this time. So, universities, you would suspect, are already quite resilient. They are amongst the oldest existing social institutions in continuous operation. I mean, alongside some sort of monarchies, the Catholic Church, things like that. And the word originally comes from Universitas Magistrorum Scholarium, a community of teachers and scholars. And I think that's part of the strength and part of the reason for its longevity and our resilience. So resilience is defined as the ability to absorb disturbance and retain function, which is a nice, neat little coinage. And the response of any system to shocks and disturbance depends on context. So not every university is the same. Connections across scales, and I want to talk about that further, and its current state, because of course sometimes you're in a stable state, sometimes you're in an unstable state, sometimes you've got financial reserves, sometimes you haven't, sometimes the students are interested in what you've got to offer and sometimes they're not. So I want to talk about things changing at different scales, and I want to use a model devised by Stuart Brand called pace layers. And he says things don't and should not change at the same rate, that the society, in fact the world, is organized in layers. Fast layers innovate and the slow layers stabilize. And he defines 6 of these layers. Nature at the bottom there, all the stuff that we grow and we dig out of the ground and things that we take for granted. Culture, the millennial universities, the millennial scale social institutions. Governance, how we organize those. Infrastructure, the big projects that stabilize it. Commerce, and fashion and art. And these layers are not only distinct, but they move at different paces. Nature moves extremely slowly, and right up to the top, where fashion and art are constantly innovating and constantly changing. So fashion is not just fast, but it's irresponsible. Its whole raison d'etre is to change, is to do something new, is to throw things away, is to get moving. Commerce on the boundaries with that takes some energy from the variety. So people want a new phone every year, they want to change, but the point of commerce is to make money. Infrastructure is not commercially viable, but you have, and it's on a longer time scale. I mean, that's why it's not commercially viable. You just can't realize a profit in the time it takes to, you know, build a bridge or a road or something like that. So they tend to be funded by governments. Governance at the moment, largely we have democracy, we have rule of law. This changes very slowly. And interestingly, over the 20th century, we've had a new sort of what's called a social sector work coming up. Things like the World Wide Fund for Nature, the National Trust, things that as a culture, we see that we have to take care of. Culture, work of millennia, of whole people, and nature, seasons, volcanoes, the work of the whole planet. So this is how the model fits together, with each of these layers moving at their own speed. And we can, and this works at many, in many instances. And every form of civilization has a wise equilibrium between the firm substructure and soaring liberty. So education fits in the infrastructure point. It has high cost, high yield, but slow payback. So you can't leave it over to commerce. It has to be a foundational platform for society. And the change ideally is measured in decades. So this division allows us to relax a bit. It allows us to be fairly relaxed about fashion and about technology, doing all their things and changing, because if the government controls and the cultural mores and the wisdom change slowly, that's okay, that allows it to happen. It's only when things break through the layers that you get problems. One of the problems is fast layers dictating to slow layers. So when you get market values determining the value of education, like the only value of a university education is to get a job, or to get a job in a certain sector, or to be a productive citizen, to be educated so that you can slot into something that Silicon Valley demands, then you've got a problem, because then you've got something out of kilter. Another kind of problem pace layers is when slow overtakes fast. So governance dictating change that's not supported by culture. So then you get revolutions, Russian Revolution, French Revolution, things that happen too fast for the culture to adapt to. And indeed, I think Brexit might be one of those as well. Then the other kind of slow overtaking fast is when we disturb the pace of nature. Climate change, greenhouse gases, the extinction engine of that we're creating by getting rid of species, and indeed COVID, are all examples of us fiddling around, accelerating the pace of nature, changing that layer, the nature of that layer. So that's a model that I'd like, and I'd like to get into our minds, and I'd like to think about. And so in terms thinking in this model in terms of teaching and learning, how can we build resilience? How can we absorb disturbance and retain function? So you have to think about, well, what do we mean when we're talking about teaching and learning? What do we mean by function? So universities still attract students. Students do want to learn. They want to come and they want to learn, and they want to learn at universities. And that's important to remember, that we're still an audience, there's still appetite for our product. And the work of a university, in this case, is to guarantee their staff to their students. That's what a university does, that brokerage, to say you come here and you will get this kind of teaching, is something universities are good at. I'm just going to make an aside here, looking at those icons of professors at the bottom. It's almost impossible to find an icon of a professor that doesn't have glasses. Just wanted you to know that. Very strange thing. So this brokerage, this guarantee that we're going to give you this kind of teaching, this is called teaching, this relationship between staff and students. And good teaching needs both currency and community, and both of these, it turns out, are oddly problematic. So currency is staff knowing what they're teaching, knowing their stuff, being experts in an area, a domain. Now, if you're teaching in an area that you're familiar with, that is your research area, then actually you have a lot of familiarity, you know the hooks, you can elaborate, you can follow questions when students ask, you're pretty current, it's pretty nice. But most often that's not the case. Most often people are teaching non-specialist areas. And there's other kinds of documentation that address that. There's the ACM curricula, the QA benchmark statements, which kind of give you an overview, say these are the sorts of things that students should be learning. They should be learning them in concert with these other things. You should have some of this, more of that, less of that. I've had the privilege, the pain to work on both of these over time. And this is a quote from someone who worked on the QA benchmark, the ACM curricula with me, and says, these kinds of things are 10% respect and honor and 80% and 90% hard work that nobody really wants to do. So they do have a kind of a flavor to them. They do have a kind of, I mean, they're meant to be prescriptive, but they also are a little dry to read and a little difficult to handle. And to keep current, staff have to want to do it. And it's still true. This is a quote also from the curriculum document. In a large university, even in a small college, for the most part, you're going to be judged on how much work you're publishing. Secondarily, even in a teaching school, secondarily on your teaching. And there's been huge efforts over my career to change this, and I think it's very resistant. I don't think this changes very much, partly because it's very hard. So it's very easy to judge research outputs. It's very easy to count how many papers you're publishing, how much grant income you've got. It's very easy for the institution to put a metric on that. Much more difficult to put a metric on to say that you're a good teacher. So it's almost always, teaching is almost always secondary. And so to take a strong interest in making sure you're actually teaching something that's authentic and good for the students takes a lot of initiative. And in some cases, personal sacrifice, because you're not being given a lot of credit for it. So I think that's still true. And I think that's still a problem of currency. If you're not teaching in a specialist area, you've got to do some work to find out what the good things are to teach. So a lot of people then will turn to a textbook. And textbooks are problematic in a different way. I think probably the people who benefit most from textbooks are textbook authors, because what they're doing is they're writing down the way that they actually teach. And textbooks also have a strange pace layer issue, which is the publishers are interested in keeping them the same. The publishers are interested in just having another edition of the same one because the one before sold well. So you've got a strange commerce interacting with infrastructure there to probably the detriment of the content. And the last sentence of this quote here, so eventually it evolves, but it's like religion. I think again hints towards the pace layers further down, that this is, textbooks don't really work to do high quality education. So if currency is a problem, if we've got to rely on teachers to go and find stuff themselves, and the stuff they can find is sometimes not great, what do? Well, what you need to do is you need to give them teaching community. And perhaps paradoxically, guarantees of this are often found outside of the institution. So you want teachers of your introductory programming or databases or HCI to be talking with other teachers of introductory programming or databases or HCI or whatever it is. And like as not, they're not in your institution, because you're the one in your institution who's teaching programming, databases or HCI. So they simply don't have the community to hand. Also, for instance, you don't want staff to be inventing or reinventing responses to things that are happening at the moment. Of course, at the moment, we're all trying to teach remotely. We're all trying to have conferences remotely, which is very strange. And we're all individually reinventing this, and that's really not the right way to do it. What you want is you want to be in a community of people that you can talk to about this. But practice has problems. Practice is not visible. And this is a quote I like very much. It's a quote from a research project I did some years ago. And the academic said, and he was surprised, I don't know how others teach sorting. He realized this in the middle of the interview. And he said, that's a bit shocking. I don't know how other people teach something as fundamental as sorting. I know what the algorithm is and the textbooks. So he's got the currency, he understands the disciplinary domain, but how do others get students through this? So he just doesn't have a handle on the practice that you need when you're in the classroom. And that's because education is always enacted. It's always a teacher, it's always a student. You could never have, you can never have, you say, oh, I'm standing in the field and I'm teaching, because you're not, because you have to have someone in front of you, a single person, a classroom, whatever. And so it's very related to its context, the physical, social, temporal that support it. And if you look at practice any other way than that, then you're distorting it. And that's a different problem. Because in a society that attaches particular value to abstract knowledge, the details of practice have come to be seen as non-essential, unimportant, and easily developed once the abstractions have been grasped. And we are particularly, as academics, I mean, many people are familiar with abstract knowledge, but as academics, it's our trading coin. Because we're familiar with it from research. Research representations are nearly always abstract. They're nearly always replicable and often predictive. And this is a chemistry journal I want to show you because I think it illustrates this particularly well. And the author says a typical paper in this journal is about 3 pages long. 1 page is experimental detail, half a page is endnotes. The body of the article is then 1.5 printed pages with some graphics. But a particular feature of this journal is they have an experimental section at the end detailing the procedure. And here it is in great detail. All pyridine bromide salts were prepared by the literature method. The salts were precipitated from what, and so on. But the effect of this statement is to say that if you follow this, anyone, anywhere who takes these and does the same things to them that I did will have the same result. That kind of abstraction, that kind of representation is something that we're very familiar with. But teaching is not like this. The scientific method does not guarantee replication of teaching practice. I can't take the same ingredients as you have and produce the same effect in my classroom. Frankly, I can't do it twice in a row myself, let alone taking someone else's practice and doing it. And so the representation of research, that paper representation, the method, the results, conclusion, is not a good way to document teaching. So practice in any domain is hard to represent, but teaching practice is hard to represent because it's situated, it's contingent. So I may know 15 ways to teach recursion, but it only occurs to me to use this one because of the problem the student is presenting to me, and it's embodied. It comes from me and my head and I can't give it to anybody else. So teaching representations are a little different. So you get institutional representations, you get maybe student handbooks, stuff that you have at a departmental level. I create a syllabus, I put a reading list, lecture notes together, I produce notes for supervisors, I design assessments and exams. And then as I deliver it, there's the actual lecture recorded, or the notes or the slides, the exercise. The students then do the work, they submit the assignments, they get commented on, they get returned. And eventually they get guidance and notes. There's QA documentation, annual monitoring, and all of this is archived so I can go back and look at it year on year. It's fairly familiar. In a sense, they're unremarkable, but they're not created to describe the practice. They're just a collection of sort of these naturally occurring bits of stuff that occur as a result. And they're hidden. They live only within institutions. And CS teachers in other institutions can't see them at all. And that perpetuates this problem of reinvention. So I want to talk about some non-institutional practice communities that can help offset this. I want to talk about 3. The first one is, in a sense, not existent anymore, although the model is transportable. Discipline Commons was an intervention that I designed with Josh Tenenberg from the University of Washington in Tacoma, and on that URL you can see some instantiations of it. The aims of a commons is to document and share knowledge about teaching and learning within a discipline, and to establish practices for the representation of this by creating something that is public and peer-reviewed so that other educators can pick it up with some confidence. So how it works is we had 10 to 20 educators all teaching the same subject, sometimes the very same module for, well, so CS1 or databases, something like that, but all from a different institution. And in a sense, you've got a real opportunity here with SIGSI and the education champions to do something quite exciting in this, to actually bring knowledge together across a national structure. And that would be an interesting thing to look at, to build a national commons would be very interesting. So these educators, each from different institutions, each teaching the same subject, come together and they meet monthly throughout the academic year. And this gives two benefits. In the meetings, we get to know each other very well, we reflect, we share, we observe each other's teaching, we actually move between institutions and see what happens, we review each other's materials, and you have those deep and meaty discussions that you can only have with someone who shares your knowledge and your experience. But also there's verification. We document the practice. As I've already said, documented teaching practice is rare and it's non-standard. So what the product, a persistent product of a commons is a portfolio. And so each commoner produces a portfolio in the same form. So they're comparable. And once you've got, for instance, 17 portfolios all about teaching CS1 or databases, then suddenly you've got 17 approaches you compare, you can look at, you can say this one would work for me, this wouldn't. And so you get a very rich set of archived data. So the form is, each portfolio has 6 sections. The context, so you have to describe the context in which you're teaching, the content that you deliver, the instructional design, so how you pace and order that content, delivery, assessment and evaluation. And within each of those sections, there is an artifact. So one of those naturally occurring documents, one of those pieces of QA or an assignment or lecture notes, some artifact that encapsulates what you want to talk about this, and a commentary that gives it wider rationale. So you have the detail, you have the discussion, the evidence and the narrative, the what and the why. And these of course are personal, they're individual, they have to be, practice is individual, but they're not idiosyncratic, they're comparable. You can look across them and you can say, how do these 17, 20 people deal with the delivery of this? And so they're a very rich way to document and mine practice. My screen has frozen. Ooh, that's peculiar. Oh, okay. So, oh dear. Right. So that means that all commoners become expert and they work together. So you build a community and you get an unusual depth of knowledge about practice in other institutions. And normally you only get that practice by what we call charismatic embedding. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that, which is when someone turns up in your institution and goes, ah, well, when I was at Leeds, or York or Edinburgh, we did it like this. And so they're bringing the practice with them and they're saying, you should do it like this because I did it there. And that's really the only way that teaching knowledge moves through institutions. But in the commons, it moves much more naturally than that. And the documentation is public. It would be possible, it would be perfectly possible, perfectly straightforward to replicate a commons, but the funding that started it originally is no longer. So I'm not running anymore as part of that project, but I would commend it to you. So more accessible, more current community practices. One is, well, both of these come from the UK SIGSI chapter. So SIGSI is the special interest group in computer science education of the ACM, and we started a UK chapter 3 years ago. And one of the very nice things that's come out of it is a journal club, which is run by Duncan Hall at Manchester. And once a month, people get together to discuss a journal paper. And as you can see, there's one on Monday, the 5th of October, and they're discussing how to teach, learning how to teach and learn Git, which is a useful skill. And you can see their previous ones. They've discussed using theory in computing education research, how video production affects student engagement, very current, blended learning and pedagogy. So they choose papers. They choose papers, as I say at the bottom of this list. We'll pick interesting papers. They don't have to be award-winning. They don't have to be heavily cited, but they have to be thought-provoking and meaty. So they choose papers that are useful and current, and they have a nice discussion mechanism for how they select that through their Slack channel. It's the second bullet point on here that I'm particularly interested in. We are building, it's more than just the articles. We are building and strengthening communities of practice amongst peers in computer science education. And it works very well. It's a very lovely activity. And if you're interested in teaching and learning Git, I certainly suggest you join up and come on the 5th of October. The other ongoing activity of the chapter is the Sep Conference. And the Sep Conference might be unique. It's certainly different and important because it's a practice conference. It's not about research, it's about practice. And again, the bottom point here, so it's happening on the 7th of January. You can submit until the 9th of October, so you can submit to it now. And the bottom bullet point here, I think, is important. We aims to be a community, not a series of proceedings. So even if you're not presenting, turn up and listen and see what, and this year, of course, it will be virtual, so you can turn up without cost. The different and important thing about the conference is, I think, the submission format. So what you have to say when you submit to this conference is what it is, so description of what you're doing, why you're doing it, what happened before, what's it replacing, why are you doing it differently, where does it fit, so a description of your context, does it work, how do you know? Nobody does something if it's broken. You don't have to say it will work for you, you just have to say how I know it works for me. Who else has done this? So either published resources, or maybe it's the person who did it before me, or inherited it, or I changed it. Where did you get it from? What will you do with it next? Will you vary it, change it, develop it? And why are you telling us? Why is it interesting to anybody outside your context? And I think that's an extremely powerful format. It's been honed over several years now. And when you hear someone give a presentation in that format, it's such a lovely experience that you understand what they're doing, you understand why they're doing it, and the questions just automatically generate. And they're questions at an appropriate scale. They're questions of detail, they're questions of practice, rather than the more abstract questions that you get at other conferences. So I think all of these are powerful practices. They treat practice as a first-class citizen, and they expose practice in an appropriate way. And in that way, they enhance the ability to absorb disturbance and retain function. They enhance resilience, but they're not quick fixes. You can't suddenly go, oh, let's do that now. You have to give the time and the maybe institutional time to let people do this. So researchers say that innovation and growth and change comes from creative tension on the boundaries between those layers. And I just want to talk very briefly about a creative tension between the education and the commerce layer in the form of degree apprentices. I've done a couple of pieces of work over the years, and I'm currently engaged in a piece of work with degree apprentices at the University of Glasgow, which is a very interesting scheme. And so this is a little bit tentative and it's not finished, but I think it's interesting because degree apprenticeships are driven by commerce. They're driven by the need for businesses to have graduates. And you have to ask, well, why are people doing this? And so for some of them, it's purely financial. We've done some work and the students go, it's a better way for me to do it. Some were previously failed by our system. Here's a lovely quote I had. Some tried a university degree and dropped out. I was talking with one the other day and he said, I went to that university. He could sort of do it, but there was nothing making him do it. And he found it very difficult to keep motivated, to keep working. Of course, in the company, you've got your business manager and everyone else on your neck. There's no problem about motivation. So the education that we offer doesn't suit everybody. And so having this negotiation with commerce and having a different structure suits some students better. Some weren't failed by education, but never engaged with it, and worked for years in jobs, but now they've found what they want to do and they've come back in. And some like to see the immediate practical uses. So these are themes that are emerging from the work I'm doing at the moment with these. And I do think there are evidence of constructive disturbance, that these students are getting something that they couldn't have got otherwise. There is also, of course, destructive disturbance. And I think that's where we are now. And I was talking to some colleagues just the other night, and they said, it's terrible, I hate it, I don't like teaching like this, I'm more stressed than I've been for decades, it's a horrible way to do it. So I think we can agree that it's not the best way to proceed. The problem is when you're looking at complex systems and you're looking in sort of this pace layer framework, that change is not gradual. Change goes through what's called an adaptive cycle. So if you look at this figure of 8 here, it starts how to describe it, going up from R to K. The white ribbon is growth and conservation. It's a very slow phase, and that's universities growing up resiliently over the years, slow, just building up resources. But when you do that, you also get to a point of optimization. And the more you optimize a system, the less resilient it is to shocks. And so there comes a shock, and when you're in K, you get a collapse or release, which is omega, and then a reorganization. Now that black return loop is normally quite fast. And you get to the point when you start building up to a new stability. And the problem is that's what change looks like when you're in this sort of system. So resilience, educational resilience, is not going back to an old way of doing something, but coming to a new stability. And I don't know very much, but I know that post-COVID normal will not be the same as pre-COVID normal. But I also want to remind you that over the long term, universities are very resilient. And so I look forward to seeing you on the other side.
Thank you, Sally, for that. That gave us a lot of food for thought, and I, for one, have many questions for you. For everyone listening, Sally will join the Education Champions panel at 10, and we're starting that at 10 because a few people are teaching just now. But in the meantime, I have a few questions for you, Sally, if that's okay.
Sure.
And if anyone has questions for Sally, I believe you can use our platform to submit questions, and they will make their way through to my iPad. So please send questions over. So to start off with, I'll take the last thing you said. You said to us that the post-COVID normal is not going to be the same as the pre-COVID normal.
I'm pretty sure.
Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
I think we can't avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have a choice. Am I on camera now? Can you see my face now?
You are, yeah.
Oh, good. Right. I'll look at the camera then. Because of the nature of this sort of ecosystem change, you can't go back to the old stability. You can't, if you're talking about in terms of ecosystems, you can't reforest the Amazon quickly. You know, you've got to find a new stability and a new change, and then things will settle down. And so I think it's inevitable that we're not going to go back, or not completely go back, to lecture theatres and seminars. I think some of the practices that will develop here will carry over.
And off the top of your head, what are the biggest implications these will have on teaching? These are questions I've had for a while, and it's good that I'm able to throw them at you.
I think it's going. I think it's going to bring in more teachers. I mean, we are already using more and different sorts of staff to either teach very small groups, and groups being virtual. The way that we're looking at running programming labs is much more intimate, much closer to in a sense, the practice, to them tapping on the keyboards. And that's actually quite good. Actually, the students are liking that. And so I think that's going to be an interesting thing to look forward to.
Absolutely. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat to see so I'm not hogging all the questions myself. There's loads of comments on lovely talk, thank you, so on and so forth. I'm not sure you can see them.
I can't.
Okay, I'll read them at you. And someone said it's a really nice perspective. I'll print screen them for later. I do have one more question for you then. You spoke a lot about non-institutional approaches, and I really enjoyed that bit where you spoke about the importance of bringing people together to discuss education and practice at a number of levels beyond the institution. And of course that resonated because SIGSI represents all the universities across Scotland. You touched upon 3 very important and unique innovations and formats. So again, my question for you is, do you think those 3 and ultimately culminating in Sep is enough, or do you foresee another perhaps evolution for these non-institutional formats?
So the nice thing about Sep and the Journal Club is that they mimic research forms of practice. So universities are very familiar with them, and so they understand what they're doing and what they produce. And I think that's a great strength. Also because, and it's always mystified me, that if I take someone's paper and I reproduce big chunks of it, I get kicked out for plagiarism. But if I take someone's teaching slides and I use them, and I'm applauded. So it's always mystified me that you don't get this authorial attribution with teaching materials. And of course, Sep gives you that. It gives a name at the bottom to say, look, I did this. And so you can track citations. You can actually make the teaching a bit more visible. So I think those are very good. The Discipline of Commons is a very different model because it's much more developmental. I think ultimately it's extremely valuable, but the power comes the more you do it. And it takes a little bit of funding. It doesn't take a lot of funding, but it does take a little bit of funding. And in these times, that's not as free as it was. The other model that I think is quite interesting is a bootstrapping educational research model, which is in a sense similar to the Commons, that you bring people in from a number of different institutions. You address a common research question. It can be something simple as, how do you teach for loops? I don't know. But you come together, again, it's this community model. You come together, you devise a question, you do the reading, you devise the experiment. You then go back into your classrooms. You all do it individually in your own classrooms, and then come back and analyze the data in aggregate. And that gives you a value higher than a single classroom. So I think there's a lot of models out there about this. And I think if we don't grasp them, we're just going to fall back. Absolutely.
It's our responsibility, after all, as practitioners and researchers, to see what works and determine best practice. And there's a lot of nice, sorry.
No.
There's a lot of nice initiatives happening both here and stateside. I remember a few years ago, they launched csteachingtips.org that aimed to get all best practice and share it with everyone. And then there was a similar one, the NCWIT. I can't remember what the resource was called, but essentially they tried to peer review practice and publish it so people could access it. So yes, there's a lot going on, and I think we should be capitalizing and using these things to better our student experience. So again, thank you very much. I think there's 5 minutes left before the panel, so I might let you grab a coffee.
Oh, thank you.
Start again.